Hi, I'm back, and now we're going to read about measles. This is part 2. After I spent days researching the data sources for those graphs, manually typing in the numbers from the reports into my own Excel spreadsheets to see if they matched, I finally gave up. I had to accept something that, for me, was very difficult. Many of the diseases we now vaccinate for ceased to be deadly long before vaccines were ever invented for them. Other diseases for which vaccines were never developed follow the same trajectory. It was so confusing. I had been told that vaccines saved us from all these diseases, but the cold, hard data showed that they had very little to do with the huge decline in deaths from disease. If you're like I was, you're probably shaking your head right now, trying to figure out where the disconnect is. Someone must be lying about something, right? Think about measles for a minute. If you're younger, the only thing you may have heard about measles are stories on TV about scary outbreaks. Just a few decades ago, measles was considered a trivial illness, like back when I was young. Just like a cold any child might catch during the winter. It was a rite of passage for every child and was routinely joked about on TV shows like the Brady Bunch. However, once a vaccine was developed for the disease, health officials and doctors began to speak of infection as a terrifying event, mainly because most people weren't scared enough of measles to get the vaccine. What do anti-vaxxers think about measles and the vaccine? The measles vaccine does work for some people. It does create some protection from a measles infection. You may feel like this is an unexpected statement coming from an anti-vaxxer, but let me reiterate an earlier point I made. Our goal is as few vaccines as possible. To do this, we need to accurately calculate the risk versus benefit from every vaccine to maximize the chance of having a healthy child. Many of us don't have a fanatic devotion to avoiding vaccines. We are simply calculating risk and benefit in hopes of having the highest chance of good health. Just like you, we have no desire to put our children needlessly at risk. There are vaccines that do work with a very large asterisk. They are a hack, an attempt to cheat Mother Nature at one of her best tricks: immunity from future attacks of a particular bacteria or virus. You see, vaccines can create a type of immune response, but it's often much different from catching the disease naturally. As a result, vaccines don't work exactly the way we'd like. They also don't protect for very long. A natural infection typically gives you immunity for life, whereas a vaccine only works for a few years, sometimes not at all. Certain vaccines will have an impact on measurements of the disease. For measles, the vaccine did affect the number of children coming into the doctor's office with a measles infection. It did not affect the deadliness of the disease. Apparently, certain people with pre-existing health problems unrelated to measles are likely to have trouble with a measles infection, whether they are vaccinated for it or not. These people may really struggle with what would be a harmless infection in other people. This is why measles is still a problem in third world countries. It is not because they have a shortage of measles vaccines, but because these countries have many people who are severely lacking vitamin A. In developed countries, this deficiency isn't a problem, and you almost never see anyone dying from measles, not because they're not catching it, but because it's just not a deadly disease in healthy people. The measles vaccine didn't move the needle on measles deaths in the U.S. If you vaccinate your child for measles, they will require frequent boosters for the rest of their life to be considered truly protected. Because anti-vaxxers are trying to minimize the number of vaccines their children receive, many opt out of the measles vaccine. The disease is, for most, a trivial infection, and in its natural state will create immunity for life. No boosters will ever be needed again. If you're following along, you may agree with me, if only partially. You may be thinking, sure, some of the more obscure diseases stopped being deadly before the vaccines came around, but what about polio? You cannot say that the polio vaccine did nothing to save children from death and paralysis. Polio was a big stumbling block for me. I had gone through the chart and finally came to the conclusion that perhaps vaccines didn't play as big of a part in the prevention of disease as I had thought. But polio, I knew there was a disease in need of a vaccine if there ever was one. How could anyone in their right mind not get their child vaccinated for polio? The answer to that question blew my mind. And then the next chapter is, what about polio? My kitty's wanting up on my lap. Get in, Chewy. Polio is probably the most famous disease we vaccinate for. Everyone can recall images of children in braces and people lying inside iron lungs before the vaccine. Anyone who grew up in the 1940s and 50s probably knows someone in their family or neighborhood that was affected by this horrible disease. As the story goes, in the 1950s, a vaccine came along and the disease disappeared. You stopped seeing children in braces and the iron lungs became a thing of the past, a heroic story of man over microbe that no one can deny, right? I became so obsessed with this story, I ended up writing an entire book about it titled The Moth and the Iron Lung. Again, that's by Forrest Maready. The truth about polio is not quite as simple as we're told, and it is decidedly more horrible than you can imagine. Polio is a nickname for poliomyelitis, which means inflammation of the gray matter of the spinal cord. If you get a lesion on your spinal cord, that part of your body may develop paralysis. This disease nearly always occurred in children, which is why it was called infantile paralysis for decades. It almost always started in their legs, and as lesions continued to move up the spinal cord, they would lose control of their abdomen, their arms, and finally the muscles that expanded and contracted their lungs. If they could not breathe, they would die. The iron lung, first introduced in the late 1920s, helped children who were paralyzed in such a way to breathe. This was a godsend because some children could eventually recover from their paralysis as long as they could keep breathing. The iron lung brought many of them enough time to survive until the lesions went away. They might have residual paralysis and difficulty walking, but they would live and for many have completely productive lives. Actually, my principal, Mr. Pugsley, who I dearly loved, he had polio as a child, and I just admired that man so much. But anyway, back to the story. Polio was basically non-existent before the 1800s. There might have been a case here and there, but you really don't see it in the medical literature until the 1890s, when it began to appear in epidemic form. Some people will point to an Egyptian painting of a man with a cane and a shortened leg as evidence that polio always existed. But as we will soon see, there is no way of knowing what caused this man's condition. As it turns out, the paralysis of poliomyelitis can be caused by many different things. Several viruses can cause it, as can several different bacterial infections. Surprisingly, pesticides could also cause it. Studies were conducted in the late 1800s with a popular pesticide called Paris green. They purposefully fed animals too much pesticide and it paralyzed them in their hind quarters, just like what was happening with children. Scientists did autopsies on the animals, found lesions in their spinal cords, and pronounced they had died from poliomyelitis or polio from pesticide poisoning. The pesticide contained a metal called arsenic and may explain why many parents originally referred to polio as teething paralysis. A popular medical treatment at the time was teething powders, a concoction given to infants who were teething. They contained massive amounts of a similar metal, mercury. Teething powders became popular in the early 1800s and appeared about the same time you start seeing isolated cases of polio. Coincidence? You decide. It became clear that certain viruses and bacteria could also cause paralysis, but only if they got inside the nervous system. For all human history, these microbes had never caused problems, but starting in the late 1800s, they suddenly gained the ability to get into the nervous system. This likely had something to do with a new pesticide that was invented in 1892, lead arsenic. It was a combination of lead and arsenic that was sprinkled and sprayed on many fruits and vegetables that were later eaten. Its popularity was due to the fact it couldn't easily be washed off with water, an advantage for farmers who didn't have to respray after a storm, but a decidedly disadvantage to mothers trying to clean their children's food. It appears that not only did this metallic pesticide create paralysis through direct poisoning, but caused a leaky gut issue in children that allowed different viruses and bacteria to pass through the intestines and into the spinal cord directly behind. Remember that humans had lived with these viruses and bacterial infections for hundreds of years with no paralysis until the late 1800s. Within a year or two of the invention of this new pesticide, polio began to appear in the same area of the country. In the 1940s, at the end of World War II, a new pesticide called DDT began being used by nearly everyone, and polio became much worse. Unlike lead arsenic, which was sprayed on food, DDT was sprayed directly onto children in an attempt to protect them from flies and mosquitoes. Ironically, it was thought these insects could transmit polio, and DDT was sprayed on children to prevent polio. Many people from this era will recall chasing the DDT truck down the street, frolicking in the clouds of pesticide trailing behind, another popular pastime that no doubt contributed to the paralysis of that era. By 1952, people began to stop using DDT because many insects had already started to develop resistance to it. Parents also began to suspect it was more toxic than they had been told. At the same time, cases of infantile paralysis or polio began to plummet. 1952 was the peak for polio cases in the United States, not just the kind caused by the polio virus, but the paralysis due to all of the other viruses, bacteria, and direct pesticide poisoning. They all began to disappear as DDT stopped being sprayed on nearly everything. Even though all types of infantile paralysis began to go away after 1952, most history books will say it's because of the Salk polio vaccine. This is just not true. The vaccine worked very poorly, and most of the public didn't even get it until years later. It was officially introduced in 1955, but was quickly withdrawn because it was inadvertently causing paralysis due to manufacturing problems. Many didn't get a polio vaccine until years later, when a different, presumably safer version of the polio vaccine, the Sabin oral polio vaccine, came out in 1961. By then, polio had all but disappeared from the United States. As it turns out, even the new vaccine wasn't actually needed. Polio had nearly vanished by then. It had appeared suddenly in the 1890s along the introduction of the pesticide lead arsenic, and had suddenly disappeared in the early 1950s alongside the abandonment of DDT. And that's D as in dog, D as in dog, and T as in Tom, DDT. The story we grew up hearing left out many important parts. The paralysis of polio wasn't caused by one virus, but many different things, all of them tied directly to the reckless spraying of pesticides that began and ended in lockstep with the appearance and disappearance of polio. I realize this may be very difficult for you to digest, but just to demonstrate the reality of what happened, I want to tell you about a scientific study that was conducted in Detroit in 1960, the year I was born. Because the initial polio vaccine worked so poorly, scientists were concerned. In an attempt to understand what was wrong, they took stool samples from almost 1,000 people who had been diagnosed with polio that summer. They did thorough testing in all the samples and determined that less than 1/3 of the people that had been diagnosed with polio actually had polio. They had been paralyzed by one of the other viruses, bacteria, or acute pesticide poisoning. This was the main reason the first polio vaccine wasn't working. the people didn't even have polio at all. They had been paralyzed by one of the many other causes of paralysis that appeared in the late 1890s and it disappeared in the 1950s. It didn't matter that many of them had received 4 or more injections of the polio vaccine. They weren't paralyzed by polio. But something else. If you have trouble believing this story, I'd recommend you look up The Present State of Polio Vaccines, which is a paper that covers the conference in 1960 where scientists and vaccine manufacturers were attempting to understand what was happening. Again, that paper is titled The Present State of Polio Vaccines, and that was in 1960. It is an eye-opening account of the confusion happening behind the scenes of the polio vaccine. I think I may have already read that. I'm sorry if I did. Today, countries that still use dangerous pesticides like DDT continue to struggle with infantile paralysis, also known as polio. They have controlled some of it with the polio vaccine, but remember, the vaccine only addresses a single cause of paralysis, the polio virus. Because there are many other microbes capable of paralyzing, other forms of infantile paralysis have increased nearly just as much as poliovirus-caused paralysis has decreased. If they were to clean up their environment and stop using these dangerous pesticides, all forms of infantile paralysis would likely disappear just like they have in other countries. This is why anti-vaxxers skip the polio vaccine without the least bit of concern. We know that there were many different causes of the paralysis of polio, and that without massive amounts of ingested pesticides, no one is likely to have a problem. And this is why it's very important to buy organic if you can afford to, especially if it's they have a thin skin like berries, strawberries, blueberries. You could possibly get away with not buying organic if it has a thick rind or thick skin like bananas or oranges, but a watermelon. But again, I would use a vinegar bath and try to get the pesticides off as best as you can if you cannot afford to buy organic. But if at all possible, any kind of a berry, something that has a very thin skin, I would definitely try to go organic, especially when you're feeding it to children. Okay, even if we lived in a country where DDT or lead arsenic ingestion was a problem, we realize that the polio vaccine only protects from the poliovirus infection and none of the several other viruses or bacteria that could also cause paralysis if given the same opportunity. The narrow focus of the polio vaccine on the poliovirus, when many other microbes can also cause paralysis, actually represents a much bigger problem with vaccines, one that actually gives many anti-vaxxers comfort in skipping other shots for their children. Okay, I will go ahead and stop it here, and the next chapter we will be reading is titled Too Many Shots? ?